In the history of cinema, some moments are defined not by what we see, but by what we hear. A whisper, a breath, a hum so subtle it barely registers until it transforms everything. In Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, The Godfather, one tiny sound cue became the difference between a good scene and cinematic immortality. This is the story of how a director's desperate last-minute decision, born from exhaustion and creative frustration, accidentally created one of the most menacing moments in film history. Little did anyone know that this microscopic detail would influence decades of filmmaking to come. The year was 1971, and Francis Ford Coppola was drowning. At just 32 years old, he found himself directing what Paramount Studios hoped would be their salvation, a film adaptation of Mario Puzo's best-selling novel about an Italian-American crime family. But behind the cameras, chaos reigned supreme. Studio executives breathed down his neck daily, questioning every decision. The budget was hemorrhaging money. Marlon Brando, their controversial choice for Don Vito Corleone, was proving as unpredictable as his reputation suggested. The pressure was suffocating. Coppola knew that one misstep could end his career before it truly began. Every frame had to be perfect, every sound deliberate. The young director would spend sleepless nights in the editing room, obsessing over details that others might dismiss as insignificant. He understood something that many filmmakers of his era didn't: that cinema was as much about what you couldn't see as what you could. But it was precisely this obsessive attention to detail that would lead to the discovery of a sound so subtle, so seemingly unimportant, that it nearly got cut from the final film. Little did Coppola know that this tiny audio element would become the secret weapon that transformed a simple conversation into a masterclass in cinematic tension. The story of this sound begins not in the recording studio, but in the exhausted mind of a director who refused to settle for good enough. The restaurant scene in The Godfather has become legendary. Young Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, sits across from corrupt police captain McCluskey and rival crime boss Salazzo. On the surface, it's a simple conversation over dinner. Beneath the surface, it's Michael's transformation from war hero to cold-blooded killer. But in the early cuts of the film, something was missing. The scene felt flat, almost mundane. Coppola watched the rough edit dozens of times, his frustration mounting with each viewing. The performances were there: Pacino's nervous energy, Sterling Hayden's bullying presence as McCluskey, Al Lettieri's calculating Salazzo. The cinematography captured the claustrophobic atmosphere of the small Italian restaurant perfectly. The dialogue crackled with underlying tension. Yet something indefinable was absent, something that would make audiences hold their breath. The director knew this scene was crucial. It was Michael's point of no return, the moment when the clean-cut war veteran would forever shed his innocence and embrace the family business he had once rejected. If this transformation didn't feel authentic, visceral, and terrifying, the entire emotional arc of the film would collapse. The studio was already nervous about the film's deliberate pacing. This scene had to work, not just work, but become unforgettable. Night after night, Coppola returned to the editing room, tweaking the timing, adjusting the cuts, experimenting with different camera angles. But nothing seemed to capture that essential element of dread he was searching for. Then, in a moment of desperation that would change cinema history, he decided to listen to the scene with fresh ears. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Coppola made the discovery that would define the scene forever. Exhausted and running on coffee and determination, he was reviewing the sound mix when he noticed something peculiar. There was a low-frequency hum in the background of the restaurant scene, so faint it was almost subliminal. Most directors would have considered it a technical flaw to be removed. The sound engineer had flagged it as audio pollution, probably from nearby electrical equipment during filming. But Coppola heard something else entirely. As Michael sat at that table, knowing he was about to commit murder for the first time. This almost inaudible drone seemed to pulse with the character's internal state. It was the sound of inevitability, of a soul preparing to cross a line from which there could be no return. The director leaned closer to the speakers, isolating the frequency, enhancing it just slightly, not enough to be consciously noticed, but enough to be felt. What happened next was pure creative instinct. Instead of removing the hum, Coppola decided to embrace it, to shape it, to use it as an instrument of psychological manipulation. He worked with his sound team to subtly modulate the frequency, making it rise and fall almost imperceptibly as the tension in the scene built. The hum became Michael's heartbeat, his mounting anxiety, his descent into darkness made audible. The technical accident had become an artistic revelation. This wasn't just sound design, it was emotional architecture, building a foundation of unease that would support the entire sequence. Years later, sound designers would study this technique, trying to understand how something so minimal could create such maximum impact. What Coppola had stumbled upon was a fundamental truth about human psychology. We don't just hear with our ears. We hear with our entire nervous system. Low-frequency sounds, particularly those around 19 hertz, can trigger a physiological response in humans without their conscious awareness. It's called infrasound, and it can create feelings of unease, anxiety, even dread, without the listener understanding why. The restaurant scene's modified hum operated in this psychological sweet spot. Audiences watching the film couldn't identify the source of their discomfort, but they felt it nonetheless. Heart rates would subtly increase. Palms would begin to sweat. The body would prepare for danger, even as the conscious mind remained focused on the dialogue and performances. This was filmmaking at its most insidious and brilliant, manipulating the audience on a primal level. Coppola understood that great cinema worked on multiple levels simultaneously. The conscious mind absorbed the story, the performances, the visual composition. But the subconscious mind processed everything else, the subtle rhythms, the barely perceptible audio cues, the emotional undertones that couldn't be articulated, but were nonetheless felt. By weaponizing this low-frequency hum, he had created a direct line to the audience's fight-or-flight response. The brilliance of the brilliance. Technique lay in its restraint. The sound wasn't dramatic or obvious. It didn't announce itself like a thunderclap or a musical sting. Instead, it worked like a slow poison, seeping into the viewer's consciousness and creating an atmosphere of mounting dread that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. On set during filming, Al Pacino had no idea about the sound that would later define his performance in this crucial scene. But watching his work in the restaurant sequence, one can observe something remarkable. His body language and micro-expressions seemed perfectly calibrated to match the underlying audio, tension that wouldn't be added until post-production. It's as if he instinctively knew what the scene needed, even without conscious awareness of the sonic foundation being laid beneath it. Pacino's Michael sits at that table like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His hands fidget almost imperceptibly. His breathing is slightly irregular. His eyes dart between his companions with the hypervigilance of someone whose nervous system is in overdrive. When the hum was finally added in post-production, it created a perfect symbiosis with these subtle physical choices. The sound became the externalization of Michael's internal state. Years later, Pacino would describe feeling unusually tense during the filming of this scene, though he couldn't quite explain why. The restaurant location felt somehow charged with nervous energy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. What he was responding to, unknowingly, was Coppola's own anxiety about the scene, the director's desperate need for it to work, transmitting itself to the cast and crew like an emotional contagion. This unconscious collaboration between actor and eventual sound design created something magical, a performance that seemed to anticipate its own audio enhancement. When audiences watch the scene today, It's impossible to separate Pacino's physical performance from the subliminal hum that supports it. They become one cohesive element of psychological manipulation. Walter Murch, the legendary sound designer who would later work with Coppola on Apocalypse Now, wasn't involved in The Godfather, but he understood the challenge that Coppola's sound team faced with this restaurant scene. Taking an accidental audio artifact and transforming it into a precise instrument of emotional manipulation required not just technical skill, but artistic intuition of the highest order. The original hum was inconsistent, sometimes barely audible, other times slightly more prominent. It fluctuated with the electrical current in the building where they filmed, creating an uneven frequency pattern that would normally be considered unusable. But Coppola's team saw potential where others saw problems. They began the painstaking process of isolating, cleaning, and reshaping this sonic accident into something purposeful. Using the primitive audio technology of 1971, they carefully modulated the hum's intensity to match the dramatic beats of the scene. As Michael's internal tension built toward his violent act, the frequency would rise almost imperceptibly. When moments of rel